Good evening, noble travellers, and welcome back to Snug as a Bug. I am Adam, and tonight we embark on an epic journey to the heart of Camelot, where magic and destiny weave through the legendary life of Merlin. Prepare yourself as we dive into Merlin's prophecy of Arthur. Witness the electrifying moment when Merlin, with visions of fate and power, foresees the rise of a young king destined to unite the realm. With unshakable resolve, Merlin guides Arthur toward his extraordinary future, setting the stage for an age of heroes. Next, we step into Merlin's love, the Lady of the Lake, a tale of enchantment and profound, mysterious passion. Join Merlin as he encounters the mystical Lady of the Lake, whose beauty and power rival his own. Their love forms a timeless bond woven through magic and sacrifice, shaping the very heart of Arthurian legend. This is only part one of Merlin's adventures, with many more tales yet to come. In part two, we'll explore the enchantment of Stonehenge and the imprisonment of Merlin by Vivian as Merlin faces his greatest challenges yet. To be notified of the release, make sure to click that bell button and stay connected as these legendary stories continue to unfold. Adventure awaits in these tales of prophecy, power, and passion. Let's dive in and explore the secrets of Merlin's world, where legends are born and history is forever changed. Merlin's prophecy of Arthur. Chapter 1. A World in Chaos. The skies over Britain were heavy with storm clouds, dark and brooding as if reflecting the state of the land itself. The kingdoms were fractured, each lord seeking dominance, each chieftain tearing at the seams of the fragile peace that once held the realm together. War, famine, and betrayal simmered beneath the surface, threatening to plunge the land into chaos. Merlin stood on the edge of a cliff, gazing out over the turbulent sea. The wind whipped through his grey beard and tattered cloak, and though he was far from the kingdom's feuding hearts, he could feel the tension in the air. He had seen the rise and fall of countless men, good and wicked, and each time the land suffered for their greed and ambition. His heart ached with the weight of it all. He had guided kings before, but none had been able to restore lasting peace. There was always another war, another hunger for power. And yet, deep within him, Merlin knew there was a prophecy, a promise of a king who would not only unite the land, but transform it, bringing an age of prosperity and peace that had been prophesied since ancient times. But Merlin feared the future as much as he anticipated it. Prophecy was a double-edged sword. A king destined for greatness often walked the thinnest of paths between salvation and destruction. Merlin, in his wisdom, knew that power had the potential to corrupt even the purest of hearts. He had seen it happen too many times before. He sighed deeply, his breath lost in the howl of the wind, and turned from the sea. He could no longer delay what must be done. Arthur's time was nearing, and the boy had to be prepared for the burdens that destiny would place upon his young shoulders. But first, Merlin needed to make the world believe. Chapter 2. A Child Hidden in Shadows. Years earlier, Merlin had hidden the newborn Arthur away from the eyes of the world. His mother, Lady Igraine, and Uther Pendragon, the High King, had entrusted Merlin with the child's safety. But Uther, drunk with power and driven by his own ambitions, had sown the seeds of his kingdom's destruction, leaving it vulnerable to ruin the moment his reign ended. As Merlin placed the infant Arthur into the arms of Sir Ector, a nobleman of humble and honourable standing, he felt an unfamiliar pang of doubt. He had seen countless futures, but the moment he looked into Arthur's innocent eyes, the weight of the boy's future pressed upon him with unbearable clarity. He saw the countless battles Arthur would fight, the betrayals he would face, the heartache that would define him. But he also saw a glimmer of hope. a brightness that could one day shine beyond the violence and tragedy. Merlin had never felt such uncertainty and conviction in equal measure. "You must raise him as your own, without revealing his true lineage," Merlin had told Sir Ector, his voice laced with urgency. "The time will come when the boy must know, but that time is not now." Sir Ector, a man of honor and wisdom, took the child into his household without question, though the mystery of the boy's origins would linger in his heart for years. Merlin watched from the shadows, ensuring that Arthur's upbringing remained free of courtly politics and the trappings of nobility. The boy grew strong, not in a palace, but in the rugged countryside, where he learned the values of honesty, humility, and service, qualities he would need to carry the immense burden of kingship. Yet, despite his careful planning, Merlin's heart remained heavy. He knew Arthur would not stay hidden forever. The prophecy would demand the boy step into the light, and when that day came, Merlin would have to face the bitter truth that he could not protect Arthur from the hardships that awaited him. Chapter 3. The Coming of the Prophecy. The air was thick with anticipation as Merlin stood in the great hall of Uther's castle. The High King's death had left a void that no lord or noble could fill. The kingdom was a powder keg on the verge of civil war. No heir had been publicly acknowledged, and the lords of Britain circled like vultures, eager to claim the throne for themselves. But Merlin knew better. Arthur was the rightful heir, and the time had come for the prophecy to be fulfilled. He had spent years preparing for this moment, weaving the threads of fate together, ensuring that every step would lead to this day. As the nobles bickered over the empty throne, Merlin stepped forward, his presence commanding silence. His staff struck the stone floor, echoing through the hall like a thunderclap. All eyes turned toward him, and in that moment he was no mere wizard. He was the voice of destiny itself. "Britain shall have its king," Merlin announced, his voice steady and resonant. "But it will not be by bloodline or birthright that he shall ascend. The one who draws the sword from the stone shall be the true king of this land." A murmur swept through the room, disbelief mingled with awe. The lords and knights exchanged glances, their minds racing with thoughts of power and glory. But Merlin's eyes were distant, already seeing beyond the petty squabbles of the court. He had placed Excalibur in the stone himself, binding it with ancient magic. Only Arthur, only the one chosen by destiny, could draw it. Yet, as Merlin stood there, he could feel the weight of the prophecy pulling at him, filling him with both dread and hope. Arthur's time was coming, but Merlin could not shake the fear that the boy was unprepared for what lay ahead. The prophecy was clear, but the journey to fulfilling it would be fraught with danger, both external and internal. Chapter 4. The Sword in the Stone. The morning of the trial dawned with an unnatural stillness. The sky was cloudless, yet the air was heavy, as if the very earth was holding its breath. In the courtyard of Uther's castle, Excalibur gleamed in the sunlight, its blade buried deep within the stone. Knights and lords gathered around, each man eager to prove his worth. They jostled for position, their armor clinking, their faces set with determination. But none could draw the sword. One by one they stepped forward, hands grasping the hilt, pulling with all their might. And one by one they failed. The sword remained firmly rooted in the stone, unmoving, as if mocking their efforts. Merlin stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes fixed on the sword. He knew this was the moment that would change everything, but even now he felt the uncertainty gnawing at him. Would Arthur rise to the occasion, or would he falter under the weight of his destiny? From across the courtyard, Merlin saw Arthur approach. The boy, now a young man, was tall and lean, his face etched with the quiet strength of one who had grown up far from the luxuries of court life. He was not dressed in the finery of the nobility, but in the simple garb of a squire. Yet there was something about him, something that made him stand out among the crowd of lords and knights. As Arthur stepped forward, the crowd fell silent. There was no fanfare, no proclamation. He approached the sword with the same calm certainty that had guided him throughout his life. And when his hands closed around the hilt, Merlin felt a surge of magic, ancient and powerful, rising from the earth. The sword slid from the stone as if it had always been meant for Arthur's hands. The crowd gasped in shock, their disbelief palpable. But Merlin's gaze remained on Arthur, watching as the young man held the sword aloft, its blade catching the sunlight. In that moment, Merlin saw the future unfold before him. He saw the battles Arthur would fight, the enemies he would face, and the kingdom he would build. But he also saw the darkness that would haunt the boy, the betrayals, the loss, the loneliness that came with kingship. Merlin's heart clenched with both pride and sorrow. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but it had set into motion a series of events that could not be undone. Arthur was the king Britain needed, but the price of that kingship would be steep. Chapter 5. The Burden of Kingship. The days following Arthur's ascension to the throne were filled with celebration, but Merlin felt no joy. The court was alight with talk of the young king, of how he had drawn the sword and fulfilled the prophecy. But Merlin could see the weight of it settling on Arthur's shoulders. Arthur was a natural leader, but he was still young, still untested. And while the prophecy had placed him on the throne, it had not prepared him for the trials he would face. Merlin watched as the boy king struggled with the demands of his new role, his heart torn between duty and the desires of his youth. Arthur sought Merlin's counsel often, but the wizard could see the cracks forming in the young king's resolve. The lords of Britain, though they had sworn fealty, were not united. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface, and Merlin knew it would not be long before Arthur would have to prove himself not just by prophecy, but by action. One night, as the two sat by the fire, Arthur turned to Merlin, his face shadowed by the flickering flames. "Am I truly the king this land needs, Merlin?" Arthur asked, his voice quiet but heavy with doubt. Merlin studied the young man, seeing in him both the boy he had once known and the king he was destined to become. "You are," Merlin replied, his voice soft but firm. "But being king is not about destiny alone. It is about choices, Arthur. And the choices you make from here on will define the kingdom." Arthur stared into the fire, his brow furrowed in thought. "And what if I fail? What if I am not strong enough?" Merlin felt a pang of sorrow at the question, for he knew the burden of kingship would weigh heavily on Arthur. He had seen the darkness that awaited, but he could not reveal it to the young king. Instead, he placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, offering him the only comfort he could. "You will not be alone," Merlin said. "I will be with you, as will the knights who follow you. But more than that, the land itself will guide you, for you are its rightful king." Arthur nodded, though the doubt remained in his eyes. Merlin knew that the trials ahead would test Arthur in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but the journey was far from over. Chapter 6. The Prophecy Fulfilled Yet Unwritten. The following week saw Arthur solidify his rule, calling knights and lords to his banner, establishing order where there had been chaos. Yet, as Merlin watched from the shadows, he could not shake the feeling that something darker loomed on the horizon. The prophecy had promised a great king, but it had also hinted at the cost of that greatness. Merlin had seen visions of blood-soaked battlefields, of betrayal within Arthur's inner circle, of a final devastating blow that would shatter the peace they had worked so hard to achieve. But for now, Arthur's rule was strong, and the people of Britain began to rally around their new king. The court was filled with whispers of Arthur's wisdom and bravery, of how he had drawn the sword and united the land. Yet Merlin's heart remained heavy. The boy he had once hidden away had become a king, but the prophecy was far from complete. There were shadows in the future that even Merlin could not fully see. As he stood in the great hall of Arthur's newly formed court, watching the young king laugh and talk with his knights, Merlin felt a cold chill run down his spine. He knew that this moment, this fragile peace, would not last. The prophecy had set events into motion, and there was no turning back. Arthur was the king Britain needed, but Merlin could not protect him from the future. The darkness was coming, and when it did, Arthur would face his greatest challenge yet. And so the story of Merlin's prophecy ended not with a triumphant conclusion, but with a sense of foreboding. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but its true meaning was still to be revealed. The once and future king had risen, but his greatest battles were yet to come. Lady of the Lake. Chapter 1. The First Glimmer of Love. Merlin had always walked alone, his path set by the ancient forces that guided him, forces as old as the stars and as implacable as the tides. Though he was revered as the greatest wizard in all of Britain, his heart had long remained untouched by human desires. Love was a foreign concept to him, something he had observed from afar in the lives of others, but never tasted himself. Until the day he met her. It was a day unlike any other, a day when the veil between worlds felt thin and the air hummed with magic. Merlin had ventured to Avalon, as he often did when the weight of prophecy and fate became too heavy on his shoulders. The mystical island was a place of serenity, a haven where the forces of the universe gathered in silence, offering solace to those who knew how to listen. The lake, smooth as glass, reflected the sky with an eerie stillness. As Merlin stood by its edge, a sensation rippled through him, a feeling of being watched. The wind shifted, carrying with it a whisper that sent shivers down his spine. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the waters began to stir. From the depths of the lake, a figure rose. At first, she was merely a shimmer of light on the water's surface, like moonlight reflected on a silver pond. But as Merlin gazed, captivated, her form became more solid, more real. She was beautiful beyond words, her skin pale as alabaster, her hair dark as the midnight sky, flowing in waves around her. Her eyes, deep and knowing, locked onto Merlin's, and in that moment, time itself seemed to pause. She was the Lady of the Lake. Merlin had heard the legends of her power, her connection to the land and the waters that nourished it, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of her. There was an ancient, unearthly grace about her, something both ethereal and dangerous. And yet, as their eyes met, Merlin felt a spark ignite within him, something he had never known before, the first stirrings of love. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he possibly say in the presence of such a being? The lady smiled, as if she understood his hesitation, and stepped forward, her bare feet barely disturbing the surface of the water. "You are Merlin, the great wizard of Britain," she said, her voice soft and musical, like the gentle lapping of water against the shore. "I am," Merlin replied, his voice catching in his throat. "And you are Nimue, the Lady of the Lake." Her smile widened, and for the first time in his long life, Merlin felt unsure of himself. The weight of her gaze was both a comfort and a challenge. She seemed to see right through him, as if she already knew all his secrets, his fears, and his hopes. "I have watched you for many years," Nimue said, her eyes never leaving his. "You have done much for this land, but you carry a great burden." Merlin nodded, feeling the familiar ache of responsibility settle over him. "The fate of Britain weighs heavily on me." "Fate is not set in stone," she said, her voice a whisper now, barely audible above the wind. "It is shaped by the choices we make." Merlin's heart quickened. There was something in her words, something in the way she looked at him, that made him feel as though the path he had always walked, alone and bound by destiny, might not be the only one. For the first time he wondered if he might choose a different fate. And as Nimue's hand reached out to touch his, Merlin knew that his life was about to change forever. Chapter 2. The Deepening Bond. In the days and weeks that followed, Merlin found himself returning to the lake more and more frequently, drawn to Nimue as if by some unseen force. Their meetings became a ritual, quiet moments stolen from the world of men, where time seemed to lose all meaning. They spoke of many things, of magic, of the land, of the delicate balance that held the world together. But more than anything, they spoke of each other. Nimue told Merlin of her existence in the lake, her role as its guardian and the keeper of ancient knowledge. In return, Merlin shared with her the weight of his responsibilities as Britain's protector and seer of prophecies. There was a comfort in their conversations, a sense of understanding that Merlin had never felt with anyone else. With Nimue, he could let down his guard. He didn't have to be the all-knowing wizard or the powerful sorcerer. He could simply be Merlin. As the seasons changed, so did Merlin's feelings for the Lady of the Lake. What had begun as a spark of attraction blossomed into something deeper, something more profound. He found himself thinking of her even when they were apart, longing for the sound of her voice, the touch of her hand. But as his love for Nimue grew, so too did his fear. Merlin was no ordinary man, and the life he led was fraught with danger and responsibility. He had seen the future, glimpsed the darkness that awaited Britain, and he knew that his duty would always come first. There was no room for love in the life of a wizard. Yet despite his fears, Merlin could not stay away from Nimue. Each time they met, his resolve weakened. He began to imagine a different future, a future where he could be with her, free from the chains of prophecy and fate. But deep down, he knew it was a fantasy. One night, as they sat by the lake, watching the moonlight dance on the water, Nimue turned to him, her expression serious. "You are troubled," she said softly, her hand resting on his arm. Merlin sighed, unable to hide the conflict that raged within him. "I am a man bound by duty," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But when I am with you, I feel free." Nimue smiled gently, her eyes filled with understanding. "You are not just a man, Merlin. You are a force of magic, as much a part of this world as the stars and the trees. But even magic needs a heart." Merlin's breath caught in his throat at her words. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that he could have both love and duty. But the vision of the future loomed over him, a dark shadow that he could not escape. "I have seen the future," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I have seen what is to come, and it frightens me." Nimue's hand tightened on his arm. "The future is not written, Merlin. It is shaped by the choices we make, and we are not alone in shaping it." Merlin turned to her, his heart pounding in his chest. In that moment, he knew that he loved her more than he had ever loved anything in his life. but he also knew that their love was fraught with danger. For the path of prophecy was never easy, and the forces that governed their lives were not kind. Yet for the first time in his long life, Merlin dared to hope that love could be stronger than fate. Chapter 3. The choice between love and duty. The more Merlin's love for Nimue grew, the heavier the weight of destiny pressed upon him. He had always been a creature of fate, bound to its whims and guided by its whisperings. But now, for the first time, he found himself questioning that path. Could he not forge his own destiny? Could he not have both love and duty? But the land was changing. Dark forces were stirring, and the shadows of war crept closer. The kingdoms were divided, and Arthur, Merlin's pupil, his king, was still a boy untested by the fires of leadership. Merlin knew that the time was coming when Arthur would need him more than ever. One night, as he stood by the lake with Nimue, his heart heavy with the weight of his choice, he voiced the fear that had been haunting him. "I cannot abandon my duty," Merlin said, his voice rough with emotion. "Arthur's destiny is tied to mine, and the fate of Britain depends on it." Nimue looked at him with eyes that held both sorrow and understanding. "I know," she whispered. "I have always known." Merlin turned to her, his heart breaking at the sadness in her voice. "But I love you, Nimue. I do not want to lose you." She smiled, a bittersweet smile that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. "You will never lose me, Merlin. I am bound to this lake, to the land, just as you are. But your path is not here with me. Your path lies with Arthur, and with the future you must shape." Merlin's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he felt as though the world was crumbling around him. He wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all. Why could he not have both? Why must he always choose between duty and desire? But deep down, he knew the answer. He had always known. The path of a wizard was a lonely one, and love, true love, was a luxury he could not afford. Tears filled his eyes as he reached out to touch Nimue's face, his hand trembling. "I will never forget you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Nimue placed her hand over his, her touch cool and comforting. "Nor I you. But you must go, Merlin. You must fulfill your destiny." Merlin nodded, though his heart shattered with every word. He had always been strong, always sure of himself and his purpose. But now, as he stood on the edge of losing the one person who had ever truly understood him, he felt like a child, lost, afraid, and alone. He turned away from her, unable to bear the look of sorrow in her eyes. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, the waters still and calm as if the world itself had paused in that moment. But Merlin knew he could not stay. He had to leave, had to return to the world of men, to Arthur, and to the destiny that awaited them both. As he walked away from the lake, his heart ached with the weight of what he was leaving behind. He had chosen duty over love, as he always had, and always would. But this time, the price felt too high. And though he would never see her again in the same way, Merlin knew that Nimue would always be with him, a part of him, just as the lake was a part of the land. Chapter 4. The Final Goodbye. Years passed, and the world moved on. Arthur grew into his kingship, the knights of the Round Table gathered around him, and Britain seemed poised on the edge of greatness. But even in the midst of his duties, Merlin could never forget Nimue. Her memory lingered like a ghost, haunting him in the quiet moments between battles, in the stillness of the night when all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat. One evening, as the sun set over Camelot, Merlin found himself drawn once more to the lake. He hadn't returned in years, not since the day he had said goodbye to Nimue. But something called to him now, a pull he could not resist. When he arrived at the water's edge, the lake was as calm and serene as he remembered, but something felt different. The air was charged with a strange energy, as if the veil between worlds had thinned once again. Merlin stood at the edge of the lake, waiting, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, as if summoned by his very presence, Nimue appeared. She rose from the water, her form just as radiant and beautiful as the day they had met. But there was something different about her now, something more distant, more otherworldly. "You have returned," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of surprise. Merlin nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I couldn't stay away." Nimue smiled, though it was a sad, knowing smile. "You never could." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of all that had passed between them hanging heavy in the air. Merlin wanted to speak, to tell her everything he had felt, everything he had kept buried deep inside him for all those years. But the words wouldn't come. Finally, Nimue broke the silence. "I am not the same as I once was, Merlin. The lake has claimed me fully now. I am more spirit than flesh." Merlin's heart clenched at her words. He had always known that their love was bound by the magic of Avalon, that it could never be truly free. But hearing it spoken aloud made the loss feel all the more real. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I had to see you one last time." Nimue's gaze softened, and for a moment the distance between them seemed to fade. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to brush against his cheek, her touch cool and ethereal. "You will always be in my heart, Merlin," she said softly. "But your path lies elsewhere now." Merlin swallowed the lump in his throat, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "And yours lies with the lake." Nimue nodded, her expression filled with both sorrow and acceptance. "Yes. But know this, Merlin, I will watch over you, always. Even when you cannot see me, I will be there." Merlin closed his eyes, letting the weight of her words wash over him. He had lost so much in his life. Friends, kings, battles, but losing Nimue felt like the deepest wound of all. Yet, even as the pain threatened to overwhelm him, he knew that she was right. Their love was eternal, bound not by time or flesh, but by something far deeper. When he opened his eyes again, Nimue was gone, the waters of the lake still and silent once more. But Merlin felt her presence, lingering just beyond the veil, watching over him as she always had. And though his heart was heavy with the weight of their parting, Merlin knew that he could carry on, knowing that their love would endure, even in the silence of the lake. Chapter 5. The Eternal Bond. As the years passed, Merlin's role as Arthur's advisor and protector became all-consuming. He guided the king through battles, treaties, and the establishment of Camelot, always keeping his focus on the fate of Britain. Yet in the quiet moments, when the world was still and the fire had burned low, Merlin's thoughts always returned to Nimue. He knew that love was a dangerous thing for a wizard, an anchor that could pull him from the flow of time and magic. But his love for the Lady of the Lake was unlike any other. It wasn't a love that required presence or words, but one that existed in the very fabric of the world. Whenever Merlin stood near water, he could feel her there, watching, waiting, protecting. One night, as he sat by the great fire in Arthur's hall, Merlin had a vision. It came to him suddenly without warning, as visions often did. He saw a future filled with darkness, betrayal, loss, and the end of all that they had built. But in the vision, just before the fall, Merlin saw Nimue. She stood by the lake, her hand outstretched, her eyes filled with sorrow but also with strength. Merlin woke from the vision with a start, his heart racing. He knew what it meant. Nimue would be there at the end when all was lost. She would be his final companion, the one who would guide him through the darkness, just as she had been his light through the years. It was a bittersweet realization, but it gave Merlin a sense of peace. He had always feared the future, always dreaded the moment when prophecy would become reality. But now, knowing that Nimue would be there, he felt ready. Their love, born in the waters of Avalon, was eternal. It transcended time, space, and even the boundaries of life and death. And though they had been separated by duty and fate, Merlin knew that their bond would never be broken. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Merlin closed his eyes and allowed himself to dream. Not of kings or battles, but of a quiet lake,